Hello, another exciting lecture coming your way. One thing I wanted to show you is that you can begin, you can do PowerPoint presentations with the slides up. Periodically in a live setting, I will do that because I may, as I'm going through things, want to be able to access slides quickly and it's a little easier. I think people on a big screen can see it, but generally on a TV screen or a computer monitor, I think we need to go in and look at slideshow and then pick out whatever we're going to do. Here we can do it from current slide because we're at the beginning, or from beginning. And now it moved because I clicked. All right, so um, this lecture is actually drawn from a variety of legal textbooks. I think I'm on my third or fourth different textbook in my 8-year career of teaching legal environment. Um, the previous one was Beatty and Samuelson, and that is really where I got this from, where I followed it. But we'll see the same sort of issues in Melvin and Katz. They begin with the usual talk about why do we have a law system. I close with that. Hopefully, most of you know what I'm showing here. This is our state capital, Jefferson City, Missouri. Um, you know, the United States of America is organized as 50 sovereign entities, which have limited ability to govern, but within their own borders are really very much, I would argue, by the 10th Amendment, meant to be more autonomous. If the powers are not given to the federal government, the 10th Amendment says, then those powers are retained by the states and by the people. When we look at our constitutional grant um, of power, the people of the United States of America, let me digress for a second. I'll probably say this again in the constitutional lecture. That Patrick Henry wanted that to say the states grant this. He wanted all the states to have the power, but I think our people were a little more, uh, and it's hard every time we go through a presidential election and the results are, within half a percentage point of one another, to see that the people have a lot of power in this setting. And, we had a few little people deciding we needed to demonstrate, but that died down real quickly because it's pretty obvious demonstrations don't do anything. Voting does stuff. Anyway, um, generally in the United States, we're looking at, we begin with an idea that we're going to legislate first, okay? So when we're looking at such things, and I'm trying to show you what a great PowerPoint artist I am here, I'm doing a little stuff that's kind of transitions. And I think as you're doing your Kaltura or your media presentations, I'm not certain how we're going to be able to do those um, in this class. Uh, I want to see you do um, PowerPoints that have a few bells and whistles. Now, I started off with state and federal. It is possible in our legislation to have both the state government and the federal government operating. All right. Um, it's very rare, however. For the most part, we're either state or federal. All right. So one of the things we get to is the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment basically says that powers not given to the federal government are retained by the states or to the people. So the general purpose is if we, the people, give power to government, we know ordinarily we don't get that power back. We've given away some freedom. Every time we ask them, there ought to be a law, Well, they'll be glad to create it because it gives them more power over our lives. I'm not opposed to government, but we have to understand that the elites of both parties or all seven parties, if you're in a different country, um, just kind of like power. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And, they oftentimes think they know better than we do, and they're going to help save us from ourselves. People on the other side say, no, we'd rather be able to make our own determinations. But we will see as we go through this, there are Jay Goulds who take advantage of other people who, and I don't mean to be really rough on Mr. Gould, but his moral fiber makes the Enron guys blush. Is kind of where I am. But um, anyway, the other thing is the supremacy clause, which I believe it's either the fifth or sixth um, article in the Constitution, that any place where the federal government has power, its law is supreme. Now, this has led to something in business called the Dormant Commerce Clause. If the federal government has power and it doesn't exercise it, that means the state governments can't walk in either. The failure to exercise is a form of exercise, if that makes sense. It's sort of like, the failure to brake in an automobile collision is a choice, and you chose not to do the right thing, ergo, you're now liable. Here, if the federal government has chosen, pardon me for cleaning off my desk here, but if the federal government has chosen not to regulate in that area, it ordinarily means they think the area doesn't need regulation. So local ordinances, this is a way we may be able to challenge them. Don't always hold your breath here. Most courts, as we find, tend to defer to regulative or legislative bodies. Um, and as I move to that, we're looking at in most states, Nebraska is the only exception. We have a House of Representatives and a Senate, very much like at the federal level. Nebraska in the depression of the 1930s, in the last fiscal crisis that you guys grew up with, is close to that, but nowhere near as terrible an outcome. Um, anyway, they saved time by doing it. The purpose of the House of Representatives is to generally represent people in a small area. The Senate is the more ponderous. They're the ones who want to think a little bit more deeply about policy. It comes from the word sena, which is also the root of senile, but it means calm, composed, aged. It is a Latin word. You're going to see a lot of Latin in this, and I've got another lecture that I talk about why do we have so much Latin? It's because the Romans eventually took most of the world's laws and codified them and then spread it through conquest, particularly to Britain. But they took the laws that come out of the Silk Road, the great mercantile trading places, and other places, but they take all the laws of Mesopotamia and bring them into code. It's really kind of an interesting thing. And the Senate they're the kind of deliberators, if you will. They're the people who have made it in life and are above influence, supposedly above bribery. Certain people have shown us that's not always true, but anyway, to become law, a bill has to pass both the House and the Senate. It can originate in either one of them. If it does, they may have to conference them, come up with a new law that both houses then pass, and then it goes to the governor. There's the governor's mansion. That internet image did not blow up very well, but the governor has veto power. And this is one of the most powerful things of the governor or the president. Um, and basically, what they can do is say, I realize you guys passed this, but it's not a good idea. For instance, right to work in the state of Missouri, I'm just drawing one that I see a lot about, um, has been vetoed routinely. The Republican House and Senate of the state of Missouri have passed it 3 or 4 times, and the governor has always vetoed it. And the majority in the House and Senate is what we call veto proof. You must have 2/3 of the votes in order to override a governor's veto. Even, and legislatures are oftentimes a little bit reluctant to do that because the governor is meant to be, really this super senator, if you will. They really have, I've got to really think hard about the whole idea. The real purpose of them, though, is the execution of the laws passed by the Senate. They are not meant to be autocrats. They are meant to be executives of the laws passed by the legislature. Pardon me. They're meant to oversee the administrative world that has generated now. And now we get to go into administrative agencies because once we get to the governor, and we can see this if we look at the Missouri Constitution, which I may or may, I probably will address in the lecture on that. That you'll see that the Missouri Constitution primarily creates a lot of administrative agencies. All right. Now, generally, agencies can be executive or legislative or judicial. What we've tended to find is that almost all of them really are executive. They're through the executive branch. They're under, they're kind of populated by the governor gets to nominate the leaders for them. Those leaders then get to select the workers, with the exception of lifetime career people, although there's no sinecures supposedly at the state or federal level, but some civil servants, once they're in, it's pretty hard to get them out. There are administrative agencies that we find at the legislative branch. A lot of times they're doing like the Congressional Budget Office. They're doing investigative work for the Congress. The judicial is very similar, but we have things like the Workers' Compensation Administration, which is an agency of the judicial branch. There are also sometimes bankruptcy tribunals that we might categorize as administrative agencies. I think you're stretching it. For the 80 or 90% of all administrative agencies tend to answer to and act at the behest of the executive of both federal or state. Well, what these agencies oftentimes do with legislation is, pardon me. Anyway, pardon me. The words I have up are clarification and enforcement. And what we're talking about there is that sometimes the legislation is not perfectly clear. A good example is always the Internal Revenue Service. The Internal Revenue Code is kind of a nightmare of regulation. It oftentimes takes, or a nightmare of interpretation. It oftentimes takes the Internal Revenue Service 3 to 4 years to unwind the language of Congress. So sometimes we'll see laws enacted, but the enforcement is delayed, or the utilization by businesses or individuals is delayed until the Internal Revenue Service publishes regulations that say, here's what they meant, here's how we're going to enforce it. In order to do this, sometimes they will actually have hearings. They can be either public or they can be closed. When they're closed, ordinarily that means you get an invitation to them because you're interested in it. The agencies all have subpoena power. That is, they can subpoena you in to testify to help it. Um, I guess this is much more in enforcement, or in enforcement, I should be saying. Um, if you're in violation of agency regulation, they can subpoena you in, they can subpoena people at your workplace in, and you have to abide by that, or you maybe go to jail until you're willing to talk. Almost all administration administrative agencies have the power to punish. They can issue fines and penalties. We can see this in the VW diesel um, emissions problem, where they're sitting there looking at, um, they kind of built a way to get past the admissions uh, check systems by firing their engines a little bit differently, and it turns out that their diesel engines were maybe polluting pretty heavily. Well, thus far they've settled, and that I say thus far, they've settled this, which is about a year and a half in the making. They've paid about 5.3 billion with a B dollars in fines and penalties. Some people characterize that as sort of an administrative shakedown, but they were definitely getting past the law, and they well knew it. Anyway, uh, the administration of the program can be, that they've got to sit here as they're doing things, as they see how businesses and the public interact with the regulations. They may come back and redo hearings and say, we're thinking about maybe promulgating some new regulations that would be easier for people to comply with. Because ultimately, what they're really tasked with is getting us to comply with the intent of the legislature. All right. So, um, anyway, maybe I should have put this one up earlier, but here we go. There's the Treasury building in Washington. The and IRS spells theirs. Get those tax forms in on time. Darling is what we have here. There's an old joke that the simplest IRS form is, how much money did you make last year? Send it in. We are sometimes get close to that. We've got 43% taxation. We got 95% long time ago, back in the Roosevelt administration, was the top marginal rate. But we tend to have an average take by the federal government nowadays of 18% or more of income. Anyway, I could digress pretty badly there. But you can see I've done a lot in transitions on these slides. This slide in particular has quite a few. I'm kind of amazed by this. So what role might businesses play in regulation? Now, one of the things we talk about is regulatory capture. That is, the businesses themselves ultimately capture the regulators. So there's always some tug and pull here. And we'll talk about this as we go through this slide. But one of the things that we will find is that both legislators and regulators welcome drafts where the legislators and regulators perceive a need for drafts. And so oftentimes the industry that is going to be regulated drafts it. And the industry, this is one of these areas where existing industry may draft it in such a way that startups are going to be challenged to get in. We already run Ameren UE, or whatever they're, the big power plant people may make it so that, startup power plant people have this huge burden to overcome in terms of capitalization, structure, uh, uh, you know, regulatory oversight panels, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things we find oftentimes is that regulation can be a barrier to entry. And some of the existing businesses feed on this. Stockbrokers oftentimes make it hard for individuals to give financial advice to others. Um, and the thought is um, that individuals don't have the the piece in the background, the training, they don't have the compliance back office stuff. But another reading is no, all these Bear Stearns types are making sure that nobody else can come in and cut in on their turf. um, at the same time, if we're regulating the oil industry, the oil mining industry, we want to know what they think can happen. We want them to tell us, here's what we could accomplish. Let's say that we're very worried about, methane just escaping loose into the environment. We want to go to the drillers and go, okay, guys, how do we minimize methane escape? Is there a way you can capture this and safely store it, or safely, store it and move it to a pipeline or whatever, so that we're wasting less and less of the resource and we're also releasing less into the ambient environment? Well, we're going to try to get feedback from the businesses, and that's where we may subpoena in leaders, other stuff. Um, One of the things I think we need to remember is that once they promulgate, once they give us, here's a proposed regulation, um, and we're affected by it, and we say nothing about it, that can be a sign of assent. It's sort of like the cops pull you into a room and say, hey, you stole that you stole that laptop, didn't you? And you go silent on them. Guess what? Silence is a form of speech. What? Yeah, no. Ordinary, reasonable people would stand up and go, no, I didn't. Uh, this is mine. You know, I've owned this for 4 years. I did not steal this. I don't know where you get the idea. So the same idea is playing here. You look at the regulation as you're the business owner or implementer. You've got to go through this with a fine tooth comb, maybe look at reading between the lines. What are they really talking about here? Um, and let me take a little side trip here. One of the things we see is that periodically businesses use the regulators to put law in place that, and the legislature, that somewhat favors them. To me, an example is potentially workers' compensation. Um, what we found in the 20s and 30s, well, let me give you a little history here. Around the turn of the century, the progressive Republican administration of Teddy Roosevelt was very worker oriented. Yeah, this is kind of shocking to a lot of people. They think, oh, those Republicans, they've always been there on behalf of the big agents. Well, look back in history, folks. Who freed the slaves? And believe it or not, Teddy Roosevelt was an early progressive. Some people would even say he's kind of a socialist, but he was bringing on, as a sort of mass movement, the idea that if a worker gets injured at a workplace, we need to compensate that individual. We have to put the blood of the worker into the cost of goods sold. If in making these coffee mugs, some workers get respiratory injuries, or there are injuries related to moving the boxes of coffee. We can't just cast the workers onto the street and make them wards of the state. We need a better system where we sort of capitalize the loss of that worker. Anyway, the businesses saw that they were either going to go to jury trials on injuries, or they could set up a system with an administrative agency that sort of does, uh, you lose your pinky, you get X amount of weeks of compensation. You know, your pinky is worth 10% of the hand as a whole. All right. And so they subdivide it. There's meat charts, states, and then there's states that have other ways of doing it. It's all different, it's all over the board. But what happened was the employers came in and said, let's set up a system where we can sort of annually know what our costs are going to be. And so the system we have, and I think from what I've seen, Obamacare is very similar. The insurance companies came in, wrote the legislation, said, here's what we can do. Here's what you guys want. All right, we're willing to give you that. Here's how the language that implements it. I mean, it's, if you've ever read that legislation, it is a nightmare. It makes the Internal Revenue Code look simple by comparison. Now we move to the common law. We have a statute. We have regulations. What are we missing? Case law. You know, if we've gone through all these machinations, do we really need judges and lawyers after all that? Well, of course we do. There are always going to be circumstances that cannot be foreseen. And so, you know, a lot of what we do, a lot of the fine grinding of the ultimate outcome of all of this stuff is done at the courts. So what I've given you are some pictures of courts. They're not very well set up. An old one is the old Missouri federal court building, or no, that's a city. I think that's a federal court. Dred Scott case. Here's the modern federal court. You know, he brought his case for freedom in the Missouri Supreme Court because the state of Missouri considered him a slave, but he had been in Illinois and he considered himself a free person. As we're moving, so here's the modern state. Oh, okay, I do have it right. All right, so that's an old federal. Here's the modern local federal district court, which hears cases arising inside its boundaries or maybe a little bit outside of it. The appellate court, which is this is the Supreme Court of the state of the United States of America. Inside this federal district court, there are offices for the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the federal appellate court. And then the interior picture, keep losing my mouse, is of the Supreme Court itself. This is the arguing chamber with the 9 judges sitting there. Opposed to it is the St. Louis City Court. I could have St. Louis County. That's generally what we're dealing with. Down here is the Missouri Court of Appeals, a building very close by to the, and this is the Eastern District. So there's 3 of them. There's the one that sits in Springfield. There's one in Kansas City and one in the city of St. Louis. And then we also have the Supreme Court of the state of Missouri. So we file a lawsuit in the city. It may get heard. It's not likely to have an opinion written. You know, it's usually going to be settled. About 95% of all disputes filed in city court and county court get settled. This is the county of the city of St. Louis, kind of an odd structure, but we may talk about that. I'm sorry about that. I clicked and I shouldn't have. The appellate court writes opinions. Those opinions take all the facts. They list everything that happened, and they use reasoning to come to an outcome. Same thing at the 7th Circuit, 8th Circuit, pardon me. I grew up in Illinois, I practiced in Illinois, so I just burned the 7th Circuit into my mind. And then we have a right of appeal to the Missouri Supreme Court. When we look at case flow, we may have 80,000 cases filed in the city of St. Louis annually. includes divorces, all kinds of stuff, maybe even bigger docket than that. We go to the appellate court, they maybe hear or look at 4,000 of those cases. The majority, or it's probably even lower than that, 2,000. Um, and then the Supreme Court of the state of Missouri does about 100, 120 a year. And the majority of what they do are capital cases, people sentenced to death. Same sort of standard goes to the Supreme Court, so that a business dispute has a very remote chance of reaching either the U.S. Supreme Court or the state of Missouri Supreme Court, unless it has statewide for Missouri or nationwide and that's why Obamacare, of course, gets in, because it touches every citizen. It's meant to. Um, but a dispute, a copyright infringement by Monsanto against Dow Chemical isn't likely to hit the Supreme Court unless it impacts all kind of copyright infringements across the board. All right, so maybe I should have gone on. I don't always remember all my slides. I get about 20 sets of these. Basically, what we're going to do is law meet the facts. They're going to lay out the facts. They're going to look at the statutory interpretation. Does the law have a very plain meaning? That driving over the posted speed limit is usually a pretty plain meaning statute, but it may be that something like pollution is a little more ambiguous. We're not certain whether this actually even applies. So we're going to look at things like legislative history. Is there a recording of the debates that these people gave to? We could go to a public record. There may be some adequate media reporting, as we've seen in the last and many, many elections all the time in the United States. Media reporting is unreliable. There's always some bias that the reporter just can't get beyond. What we're going to hope for is the rule of reason, but we have to also understand that judges are the same as we are. They may be active on a certain field. Some judges hate regulation, others love it. They're like, no, regulators are always right. Others are like, no, regulators usually don't know anything. They don't know their rear end from third base. And so we may get judges who get kind of active and become super legislators. All right, so if the court decides that the law is unenforceable, and I didn't put in there, what if it's unconstitutional? What if it's a power not given to the state or to the federal government? Usually the courts are going to say, if you had done it in XYZ fashion, it would be legit. Well, now the legislator can look at that decision and amend its law. All right. If the legislature chooses not to, that law may be done. Okay. I'm not certain what I have by my regulating body, but in a way, the courts act as a super regulator. They sort of go in and say, we ultimately have the right, and this comes out of the case of Marbury versus Madison, written by the great Chief Justice John Marshall in around 1809 or something like that, that basically says it falls to logic that only the courts have the power to judge both constitutionality and viability of law, because the legislature can't be trusted to kind of police itself. All right, now let's look at the idea of, why do we have laws? We can let the market control everything. The problem is the market is filled with people like Jay Gould or the leaders of Enron or, Ponzi scheme artists. 80% of all humans are wonderful, fabulous, generally honest people. It's the outliers that in many ways the law is about. We look at that bell curve. It's the people on the super, I'm so right, you should have worshiped me, and the people that are so nasty, we need to kind of keep them away from the rest of us. But let me close with talking about what has made most modern Western societies, and I limit it to the West because we do tend to have the rule of law. What has made us wealthy while the rest of the world struggles? And it tends to come down to, and this is a book that my wife read that I did not, but she reported it back to me. You have to have four things. You have to have access to capital. That is, there has to be some kind of free interchange of money, bonding systems, ability to invest in other businesses and take a share of it. You may think that, oh, everybody has that. No, you go down to South America, and that's a real big issue. A real big issue because the powerful control everything. They own all the land, all kinds of stuff. One of the things that we take for granted, free interchange of property. You go down to Peru, you need the signatures of something like 300 government people in order to do a single transfer of real estate. Well, let's be blunt. That country is all about under the table payments. Okay, Chile is probably the closest of all the South American economies to what we have. But it's an old, hey, you got to do payola boyar type system. The other thing is science and technology. And you're like, well, what do you mean by that? Well, not to pick on another entity, but a lot of times churches have decided that the teachings of science and the approach of science gets in the way of God's good work. I'm an adherent of God, but religion sometimes is really bad. And as we've talked about earlier, sometimes the people who already know all this technology want to control it and don't want anybody to develop something that blows it up. We're seeing a lot of disruption in modern technology stuff that, what looked fabulous 10 years ago, flip phones are gone. It's every 2 to 3 years, we seem to have these huge revolutions in technology. The other one is transportation. It's the ability of getting people and goods out of places where they're made or manufactured or get into places where they're desired. And so you look at a lot of the underdeveloped countries, they don't have railroads, they don't have roads. The roads and railroads they have are really unreliable. Maybe one of the reasons we're this wealthy is we built railroads in the 1830s and we built the interstate highway system in the 1950s, and we've improved it. The last item, I could leave my lecture here. What do you really need? You need law. You need a legal system that, while not necessarily completely incorruptible, it's a human system. It's not always going to be completely incorruptible, but a reliable system where the rule of law applies relatively evenly across all social strata. That if we get a divorce from a wealthy guy, we get the same treatment as someone who got a divorce from a poor guy. Okay? And that businesses, as we hold on to our property, you can't steal it. The government can't take it from you. For the government to take your property for a government purpose, it has to pay you fair and reasonable compensation. A good example of this is Venezuela. I'm forgetting, darn, I can't think of her name. The gal that just left power down in Venezuela, one of her last acts was seizing all of the offshore oil platforms, Christina Kirchner, of ExxonMobil. They had like $20 billion. No, it was actually a Spanish. It was Spanish petrol. They had 20 billion invested in all of their oil platforms offshore Venezuela. Guess what happened? Not Venezuela, Argentina. Guess what happened to them? The government seized them and gave them no money. And they had no recourse under the Argentine legal system. No, what really makes the difference is the big time rule of law that if a Jay Gould exists to steal from you, you have the right to go sue him. Bernie Madoff and his Ponzi scheme, um, when it first came through, I thought there's no way they're ever getting the money back. Well, actually, a guy was appointed trustee and walked in and began looking at all the data and recognized that, there's a whole bunch of people who kind of helped perpetrate this fraud. And they're at the upper tiers here. They were making money off of Madoff's fraud. We're going to make them pay the mom and pops who got ripped off money. I don't know of the exact outcome. I haven't seen it reported in more than a year, but I think something like 80% of mom and pop investors, or that of the mom and pop type investors, the people whose life savings they've given to Madoff, and these people are idiots. Don't, Madoff sitting there promising you 12% steady returns. You got to be an idiot to think anybody can produce that. I mean, 15 minutes of market study will tell you that. But they were relatively innocent and they were generally brought in under people who said, oh, yeah, this guy's great. He's fabulous. He's wonderful. And Bernie talked a great store. You know, um, it's one of the happiest, if you will, of all the Ponzi scheme stories was that Madoff had not completely gotten rid of everything. And a lot of what he had, they were able to actually auction off and get really good prices on it. It wasn't sold at uh, uh, judicial sales, it was sold through Sotheby's and that kind of stuff. And, so it wasn't necessarily identified as this comes out of the Madoff um, Ponzi scheme. It's like, here's a Monet. The seller is trying to, blah, blah, blah. Well, that Monet had actually appreciated in value, blah, blah, blah. Without that law in place, all these people would have been left holding the bag. And without the laws of prosecution and everything else, so what we need the ability to get money. We need the ability to advance science and technology. We need the ability to move goods and articles across and people across the land, and we need law. Once you see all four of those in place, you get the British system and you get wealth. Now, I know that's an argument for capitalism, but I'm a big fan. Thanks.